thanks so much for the invitation. Great talks, the ones that I've followed. It's always been a pleasure to participate in last year's and this year's conversation as well. I really like the format, so also to congratulate on that. Today I'm gonna I've put together a couple of slides, but Sarah, please tell me when 10 minutes are up, because I think I don't want to take too much time presenting, but rather have a session with you on questions and answers. The topic that I want to speak to today is how to make certification schemes more relevant for local stakeholders. And here specifically speaking about the certifications or standards that are being developed at the mine site level, so at the local level. To give a bit of context, if I can advance my slide, yes, here we go. So I'm based in Santiago, Chile. My name is Nicolas Maennling, and I lead the Regional Cooperation for More Sustainable Management of Mineral Resources in the Andean region, which, because it's such a long name, we just call it MINSUS in short. And essentially, it's a German cooperation project that is implemented by ourselves, by GIZ, and by BGR, which is the Geosciences Institute in Germany. We've been here since 2014, so celebrating this year our 10-year anniversary and working in the countries that you see on the map. And we're currently in the phase to develop also our next project phase that will run until 2028. The essence of the project has been for the last 10 years to promote responsible mining practices in the region. And we work with all types of stakeholders to achieve that, depending a little bit on the topic of work. The one that I will speak to today is the one on sustainable supply chains. And there I want to also give you some insights to some of the work that we're doing right now and has not yet been published, but that I'm quite excited about. So to give you a bit of a sense of the journey that we've been on, one of the focuses of the project is essentially to try and match the international ESG certification scheme developments that are going on with local development advances around mine sites. And one thing that we thought was really interesting back in 2021 was the emergence of these mine level certification schemes. So we put together a working group composed of civil society and academic actors from those Andean countries that I showed you before, and essentially to learn about these certification schemes and think through how the information that can come out of those can also inform local stakeholders. So we had 10 working sessions between March 21 and May 22, where the 4 certification schemes that at the time were particularly relevant here for the region, which is Coppermark, ICMM, the IRMA standard, and Towards Sustainable Mining, the Canadian standard, which essentially were being implemented in the region. To learn about them, have also representatives from these certification schemes explain them to the working group. And then we had a big workshop in Lima in 2022 to essentially come up with some of the recommendations of how these certification standards could also improve local governance in the mining regions. So that came out in August 2022. And since then, and I'll show you some of the recommendations that came out of it, but since then, the idea was, okay, let's try and pilot and test some of these recommendations. So in October 23, we put together a project with the IRMA standard and a local stakeholder here, the Queensland University Institute here in Santiago de Chile, to essentially test some of these recommendations in Atacama, because their 2 projects certified themselves with IRMA. And we're currently in that process. So the picture that you see there was a couple of weeks ago, where we held a workshop with local community members around the Salar to try and test some of these recommendations. And the
Nicolas,
aim is to then...
Nicolas, just to interrupt, sorry, I think your slides might be stuck. I'm not seeing a picture, for example. So what might be best is actually if we just, there we go, it's worked. It's just changed over. Aileen, is that you sharing or is that Nicholas?
It's Nicholas.
It's Nicholas. Excellent. It's
Okay.
Khaled. Amazing. Back to yourself, sir. My apologies.
So there's a long delay. I'll tell you when I switch next to see if it also switches on your screen. Yeah, so essentially that's the last picture on there. So the last, I don't know, 3 minutes I've been speaking about this slide. Now it makes more sense than before. So here are some of the recommendations. I changed slide. Do you see a new slide or are you still stuck on the old one? Yeah? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
it's gone for it. I
Excellent.
think it was, so before we could see both of them together, weirdly, but now we can see your mining certification slide.
Okay, perfect. So these are the 10 recommendations that came out of that working group. And the first one is focused on what is tested and audited by the topics that this group thought were important to include. Recommendations 2 till 6 is more the type of information and how it's shared, and the format, that it's useful to have some baseline data, how often it's measured and audited. And recommendations 7 to 10 are more the process of how these regular certification processes can be used to also interact with local stakeholders. So more of a process recommendations. And essentially what we piloted are the 4 recommendations that are now shown with circles. So essentially the format of how to return the information or the audit results to local stakeholders, that it's not a thick book with all the results. The dissemination of how to disseminate it, how to think through the participation of local stakeholders in the audit process when the results come out, and then the repetition every 2 to 3 years, depending on how often you certify the mine sites. And then one topic that also came out of the recommendations is how to strengthen the grievance mechanisms, which in most certification schemes are also part of that work. So now when we went to the Salar, essentially, as I mentioned, there are 2 projects that have been certified, one in June 23 and one in September 23. So we thought this is a good region to try and pilot some of these new forms of returning the information. So we've created a website, poster, podcasts, things that could be sent via WhatsApp to share the results. And then we went to have 2 sessions in the Salar in order to get feedback of whether they thought it was useful or not. And now with that feedback, we're thinking through or adapting essentially these results to then hand them back to IRMA, with the hope really that this pilot does not only inform the stakeholders around the Salar de Atacama, but more broadly how to provide tools for IRMA that go beyond, the thick audit report that if you go to the website today, you can check, but what process should be used in order to try and provide that feedback to local stakeholders. So that's one part of the work that we've been trying to do in this regard. And then another piece of work that we're currently doing, because it also came up in the discussions during the working group, was, well, how do these even compare to the local legislation? So what we also now did with the IRMA standard is to compare the regulatory framework in Peru and Chile this is still the IRMA standard 1. We chose the IRMA standard out of the different certification schemes primarily because it's a very complete one and very holistic one. So we thought that would be an interesting comparison for the governments. What this involved is essentially mapping the 426 IRMA indicators against the laws and regulations, define whether the standard is more equal or less demanding than the regulation, and then define whether the standard is relevant for that particular mining jurisdiction. So for example, in Chile, the use of mercury is probably less relevant than in a gold producing country. And what came out of it, and this is not yet public, these results, so they're still very preliminary, is when you look at Chile, at the Chile case study, and look at all the indicators, then 53% of all the indicators of the IRMA standard are more demanding than the regulation. 29 are equal, 2% are less demanding, 11% are not covered by regulation, and 5% were deemed not applicable. A similar exercise was done with the critical indicators. So those that in the IRMA standard are defined as critical for the companies to essentially pass in order to get an IRMA 50 qualification. And there, well, you see in the pie charts the results. So essentially, the takeaway for off-takers and buyers and investors is that if a mine is certified with IRMA, then even if it's IRMA 50 or IRMA 75, it's going much beyond the regulation in Chile. And this is the same results shown by the different pillars of the IRMA standard. So pillar 1 is business integrity, pillar 2 is planning for positive legacies, pillar 3 social responsibility requirements, and pillar 4 environmental responsibility. And then you can click through and go down to every single indicator to see according to which law it's mapped and whether or not it's more or less rigorous. So you see in blue, that's the result for Chile, in orange, the result for Peru, and then IRMA 50 is in green and IRMA 75 in red. So you see that there is quite a significant gap in a lot of the regulations. And for governments, it's been, we've also had several conversations with the respective governments here in Peru and Chile. And so it's been also a very useful tool for them to, for example, right now in Chile, they're discussing the adoption of a due diligence law and to see how the standard is trying to address due diligence issues. So being an interesting tool also for local actors to see where are the biggest gaps, and if the government is looking to address that gap, what are international best practices? So it's useful for off-takers and investors, but also useful for the local governments here. Here are some of the takeaways of our work more broadly on these certification schemes and standards that apply at the mine level for companies. I think there's a great potential to link international reporting efforts with local sustainability efforts. This we still see constantly, that these standards are more seen as something to report on. And if you go to the local community development teams, they're not really linked to these standards, right? So I think there is an effort, there is a potential to develop more activities in that regard, because a lot of the information that is monitored is interesting for local stakeholders, like, for example, water issues in the Salar de Atacama. For governments, as I already mentioned, when they review the legal framework to see where the biggest gaps are against international best practices. For civil society, to use the standards to increase transparency advocacy. So this was something that came out also of this working group that I mentioned, that they see it as a relatively good tool, although a lot of the civil society actors say, well, you know, these voluntary standards are all nice and good, but we want hard regulation. In the meantime, or even if the regulations are not taken up by the governments, it's still a very good source of information and data about the impacts of specific mining projects. For mining impacted community, access to complaint mechanisms. So for example, now in the Salar de Atacama, one part of the work was to show how they can also access the complaint mechanism of IRMA. And one component that was of a lot of interest is, so where did the project not perform well? And what are the improvement plans? And how can we as community members be part of that discussion of what those improvement plans should look like and should be? And then for the standards and international reporting efforts, I think there is an opportunity to adapt processes to make them more relevant for local stakeholders, because I think historically, or where it came from, is more from investors and off-takers. But as I mentioned before, I think a lot of the topics that are touched upon are very are of great demand also at the local level. So essentially, these efforts that we're undertaking is try to think through how to do that. And I'm fairly sure that this is also part of the work that we're going to continue to be doing in the next years. So I'll leave it at that, in the hope that we still have some time for a discussion.
Absolutely fantastic, Nicolas. Thank you so much. A round of applause, everybody, for the fabulous Nicolas, who managed to get everything to work despite those technological challenges. So thank you very much, Nicolas.